Sofia Marlene Silva was born on July 1, 1980, to parents Phyllis and Humberta. In late summer of 1996, 16-year-old Sofia was living in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and was a student at Cortland High School. Friends described her as quiet and reserved and said she loved all things purple. Her goal was to become a beautician, and she was already taking cosmetology classes as part of her high school curriculum. Unfortunately, all her dreams were shattered when her life was suddenly cut short. On Monday morning, September 9, 1996, Sofia's day started out as usual with a ride from her friend Sherry Moden in her red Hyundai car. On the way to school, they stopped at Fast Mart as they typically did and bought a soda and some gum. After school, she was given a ride home by Melania and her twin sister Angela. Once home, she called and spoke with Sherry for about half an hour and discussed possibly going to the Cougars' first football game. After hanging up with Sherry, she took her homework and a can of grape soda and went and sat on the front stoop of her house. Unfortunately, after that, she was never seen alive again. By 9:30 p.m., when her parents were unable to locate her, they called the police and reported her missing. Loads of people from the community, including family and friends, gathered at the Silva house where authorities were organizing a search. Volunteers and rescue teams, including dogs and helicopters, scoured the area but sadly found nothing. 5 weeks later, on October 14th, workers breaking up a beaver dam 20 miles east of Spotsylvania found Sofia's body wrapped in a light blue moving blanket. Unfortunately, due to the decomposition, the medical examiner couldn't be 100% sure how she died, but said it was likely she was stabbed and strangled to death. While she was clothed, she was missing her socks, shoes, and underwear. They also took note that her private part was shaved and believed her killer was responsible. I'm not sure how they came to this conclusion because Sofia could have easily done that herself. However, this would be a vital part of the investigation. There were many suspects, but one stood out to investigators, a 44-year-old house painter named Carl Michael Rausch. Rausch was renting a basement room 7 houses down from Sofia's home. His landlord told police that Rausch would sit in his van and watch the neighborhood kids. He also said that as soon as Sofia went missing, his behavior changed. He began to drink heavily and then abruptly moved out 2 weeks later, leaving behind some of his belongings. Investigators were able to get a search warrant to search Rausch's van and were able to collect fiber evidence. They also spoke to his ex-wife, 34-year-old Sharon Holm, and asked if she had ever been abused by him or forced to shave her private part, and she said no. Meanwhile, Rausch had moved to Florida, unaware that investigators were looking for him. So his ex, Sharon, called and told him he needed to come back to Spotsylvania. So he packed his stuff and headed back to Virginia, arriving around Thanksgiving 1996. Police immediately arrested him because of an outstanding charge for shoplifting a VCR. While in jail, he allegedly began taking credit for Sofia's murder. To this day, he denies this. By January 8, 1997, investigators got the break they were looking for when fibers from Rausch's van matched fibers found on Sofia. He was then indicted and charged with abduction with intent to defile and murder. They were moving forward with the fiber evidence, even though the DNA evidence didn't conclusively implicate him. So they began thinking there was more than one contributor and said that she possibly had sex with her boyfriend before she was murdered. However, her friends said she wasn't sexually active and didn't even have a boyfriend. If there was only one contributor, then it basically ruled Rausch out. 8 months after Sofia's murder, on May 1st, 1997, sisters 12-year-old Katie and 15-year-old Christy Lisk disappeared. 5 days later, their bodies were found floating in the South Anna River, 40 miles south of Spotsylvania. Just like Sofia, there was little to no evidence besides some fibers and a couple of strands of hair. Investigators also insisted that the cases were not linked, most likely because Rausch was still in jail and they felt they already had their man. This wasn't helped by the forensic examiner, Robin McLaughlin, who insisted the fibers found in his van matched those found on Sofia. It would later be revealed that the fibers never matched, and in the end, McLaughlin lost her job for the error. Plus, there was only one contributor, which means they were holding an innocent man in jail. At that point, all charges against Rausch were dropped. As for Katie and Christy, the fibers found on them were pink, which made FBI Special Agent Doug Diedrich believe they came from some kind of bath rug. There were also dark blue acrylic fibers found on all 3 girls. They also noted that the oldest sister's private part was shaved, just like Sofia's. They began to wonder if that was the serial killer's signature. This idea began to solidify once forensics discovered loose, shaved hair in Christy's shorts. With the new evidence linking the cases, they were certain a serial killer was wreaking havoc on Spotsylvania. Unfortunately, the case would then go unsolved for 5 years. That is until June 2002, when 15-year-old Kara Robinson was out watering flowers in her front yard and was abducted in broad daylight in Columbia, South Carolina. The girl was forced by her kidnapper into a container that he put in the trunk of his car. He then drove her to his apartment, where he handcuffed her and then repeatedly sexually assaulted her for the next 18 hours. Thankfully, when 38-year-old Richard Mark Ivanitz fell asleep, the girl was able to escape. She then led the police back to the apartment, but Ivanitz had already fled. Authorities called up to him 2 days later in Sarasota, Florida. However, he would never be taken into custody because he took his own life after being trapped in his vehicle following a high-speed police chase. Richard Mark Edward Ivanitz was born to Joseph and Tess on July 29, 1963, in Columbia, South Carolina, the oldest of 2 siblings. Richard's home was very dysfunctional, with his father, Joseph, being responsible for most of the abuse against the children. Joseph was an alcoholic who was frequently passed out due to his excessive drinking. When Richard was 6 years old, Joseph drowned his dog in front of him and then attempted to drown him. Both Richard's wives said he would wake up from horrible nightmares involving his father. Richard's sister, Jennifer, said their father ran the house like a prison. She said he was a very sadistic man who would beat them if they didn't get straight A's in school. She said her father was only happy when he was making them miserable. Unfortunately, Richard would develop the same misogynist attitude as his father and even dealt with extreme anger issues. After high school, Richard joined the Navy, where he served as a sonar technician. After being discharged from the military, he bounced around to different jobs before filing bankruptcy in 1997. His first run-in with the law was in 1987 when he exposed himself to a 15-year-old girl and her 3-year-old sister. He's also a suspect in the murder of Sarah Cherry. While Dennis DeChaney was convicted for her murder, some believe he might be innocent. He's also a suspect in the cases of Alicia Showwater Reynolds and Anne Carolyn McDaniel, who were both murdered in 1996 and found within 10 miles of each other near Charlottesville, Virginia. Investigators also learned that he lived in Fredericksburg, about 15 miles from Spotsylvania, around the time of Sofia and the List sisters' murders. At that point, they began to wonder if Ivanitz could be the serial killer they'd been looking for. Interestingly, they found a newspaper clipping in his current apartment about the abduction of the List sisters. They would then find Christy's palm print inside a boot inside his car, which is crazy considering it had been 5 years since her murder. Upon searching his former home in Fredericksburg, they found the carpet fibers that matched the ones found on Sofia, Christy, and Katie. There's also the fact that after he fled his apartment, he called one of his sisters and told her he committed more crimes than he could remember. He wanted her to meet him at an IHOP in Jacksonville, Florida, but instead, she called the police and turned him in. On August 14, 2002, he was officially named the prime suspect in the murders of Sofia, Christy, and Katie, and their cases were subsequently closed. Gayla Ann McNeil was born on September 4, 1953, and grew up in Springfield, Ohio. After high school, she joined the U.S. Air Force, but was discharged after it was discovered she was gay. In the fall of 1983, 30-year-old Gayla was living in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and working as a waitress. Unfortunately, she had been committed to the Brevard County Mental Health Facility after she was found standing in the middle of the road telling people she was the female Jesus Christ. After escaping from the facility, her name was placed in a database for law enforcement, but they spelled it wrong. On October 19, 1983, a police officer stopped her for trying to hitchhike in Stuart, Florida. He ran her name but found no warrants or other information due to the spelling error. At that point, he told her not to hitchhike in Stuart and let her go. The next day, on October 20th, another officer witnessed Gayla hitchhiking on Dixie Highway in Lake Worth. When he stopped her, she was carrying a clear plastic bag with clothes in it and a brown cutting board. She told the officer she was from Cocoa Beach and was headed to Fort Lauderdale. He warned her to be careful because it was in a rough part of town, and then he let her go on her way. If her name had been spelled correctly in the system, he could have saved her from the nightmare she was about to encounter. Around 5 p.m. on Friday, October 21, 1983, authorities received a call about a body in a canal in western Delray Beach. When investigators arrived, they discovered a female's nude body. She had been stabbed and strangled to death, and an autopsy determined she had also been sexually assaulted. 4 days later, the remains were identified as belonging to Gayla. Unfortunately, with little to no leads, her murder would go unsolved for the next 40 years. For years, serial killer Bobby Joe Long was considered a suspect since he murdered 10 women 3 hours away in Tampa, Florida. However, he never confessed, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder. In 2000, the DNA from the crime scene was analyzed and entered into coldest, but no matches were found. In January 2023, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram, who was able to generate an unknown male DNA profile. From there, the genetic genealogy team got to work and provided investigators with some potential leads. Investigators then tracked down those leads and were led to the relative of suspect James Henderson. Henderson worked as a local mechanic, which included working on Florida power and light trucks. DNA confirmed he was the killer, but unfortunately, he died on November 24, 1987, 4 years after Gayla was murdered. Jasmine Porter grew up on Long Island and went by the nickname Jazzy. Unfortunately, she had some downfalls in her life, but by early 1996, 36-year-old Jazzy was getting her life together. She was 6 months pregnant and living in an apartment in the Bronx with her 4-year-old son, Jeremy. Around this time, she was getting ready to move back to Long Island, but would sadly never get the chance after tragedy struck on the weekend of February 2, 1996. By Monday, February 5th, when her son Jeremy failed to show up to school, some of Jazzy's neighbor friends realized something was wrong and called the police. When the fire department arrived and opened the door, they found her dead in the front bedroom with Jeremy alive next to her. She had sadly been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. Jeremy, thankfully, was unharmed and told investigators he saw a man on top of his mother. While she lay there dead, he tried to clean the blood off her nose and wake her up with an ice cube. Investigators were able to collect DNA from under her fingernails, but at the time, it didn't lead to her killer. Unfortunately, with little to no leads, the case would go unsolved for the next 28 years. In 2021, the New York Police Department's Cold Case Unit had the DNA found under her fingernails retested, and this time they got a match to 66-year-old Greg Fleetwood. Fleetwood was released from prison in August 1994, less than 2 years before Jazzy's murder, after serving 7 years for a manslaughter conviction for killing Linda Miller. He was also accused of sexually assaulting and choking a woman in 1984, but the victim's family convinced her not to testify. After murdering Jazzy, he sexually assaulted another woman in March of 1996, but she died before she could press charges. Another victim surfaced in 2002, but since she was high on drugs during the attack, she was unable to pick him out of a lineup. On Monday, August 8, 2022, Fleetwood was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for the death of Jazzy. He's currently being held on a $750,000 bond and is due back in court on June 26, 2024. Jerimiah Matthew Watkins was born on August 22, 1972, and grew up in Terra Alta, West Virginia. In November of 1985, 13-year-old Jerry vanished into thin air. For days, search parties scoured the area looking for him. Finally, on November 12, 1985, Jerry's body was found in a shallow hole near some railroad tracks. He had suffered a severe head injury before being stabbed to death. An initial suspect was 18-year-old David Monroe Adams, but he denied involvement and was never charged. Unfortunately, the case would then go unsolved for the next 37 years. In early 2023, a captain at the sheriff's office began re-reviewing the case and noticed some inconsistent statements made by Adams back in 1985. So he found 56-year-old Adams and began conducting interviews with him. After multiple interviews, he shockingly confessed to the murder. He said they were at his house when they began arguing over a stolen bicycle. During that argument, Adams struck Jerry in the face before dragging him to a shed where he stabbed him to death. Afterward, he put his body in the shallow hole where he was ultimately found. After confessing, Adams was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. However, a grand jury upgraded those charges to first-degree murder. Adams currently remains in a West Virginia jail. Robert Hecht was born on December 27, 1929. In late 1988, 58-year-old Robert was retired from the military, living alone in Punta Gorda, Florida, and had no family in the area. Between November 26 and the 30th, Robert's friend had been unsuccessfully trying to reach him, so they called the police and asked for a welfare check. On November 30th, 1988, at 2:07 a.m., police entered Robert's house and sadly found him dead on the couch. At first, investigators thought he might have fallen and hit his head and then suffered a heart attack. However, an autopsy would show that the head injury was from a blunt object, and they subsequently ruled his death a homicide. Investigators then determined that the murder weapon was a large, heavy glass ashtray. They also estimated he was murdered sometime between November 26th and 27th. It was also discovered that Robert's brand new 1989 Lincoln Town Car was missing. The car was later found on December 1st, parked on Main Street in Lenoir, North Carolina. It was estimated that the car had been parked there since around November 29th. However, it didn't put them any closer to Robert's killer. At that point, investigators were at a loss until some of his friends reported seeing Robert with a man by the name of Ray. They were seen together at the Oyster Bar in Fisherman's Village on November 26. One of Robert's friends said the two men were heading to one more bar before heading home. That night, Ray told people he was from Kentucky and Tennessee, but had separated from his wife and had a 14-year-old daughter. It is also of note that Robert's friends had never seen Ray before that night. However, they needed more than that to track him down. Thankfully, they found 2 cigarette butts, one inside Robert's home near where he was found, and the other in his car. Since Robert didn't smoke, it was likely they belonged to this Ray person. Years later, these cigarette butts would prove vital in solving the case. Over 30 years later, in 2021, the DNA from the cigarettes was analyzed and uploaded to coldest, but there were no matches. So they enlisted the help of Othram and their genetic genealogy team. From there, investigators were given a potential suspect, a man by the name of Kenneth Ray Miller. They brought in some of Robert's friends who were shown a photo of Miller and confirmed he was the man seen with Robert that night. A criminal background check of Miller showed that he had an extensive violent criminal history, which included aggravated battery, burglary, arson, and other crimes. One of Robert's friends had even seen Miller at the home on the morning of the murder, sitting on the end of the same couch where Robert was ultimately found. Unfortunately, he would never be arrested because he died in 2006 at the age of 55 of natural causes.